Snow sealed the field kitchen, freezing even the steam lifting off the stew pot. She kept her head down, cutting roots, the knife on the board steady as breath. For 10 years, everyone knew her only as the cook, the one who kept the fire alive in winter. Outside, distant artillery boomed, the whiteout erasing every track. No one noticed her eyes skimmed the crooked map, or the way she counted the wind through the door seam. That night, the snow fell thicker. By morning, the kitchen stood empty and the front went quiet in an unnatural way. She had a name on the roster, but names in a field kitchen were only ink. People called her the cook and meant it in the smallest way, the way you might refer to a shovel or a boiler. Her hands were red all winter, raw from hot water and frozen air. And she learned early that no one looks at a person who is feeding them. They look at the ladle, at the steam, at the line moving forward. She stayed out of sight, because it was safer and because that was what the role required. The kitchen sat a few hundred yards behind the forward trenches, tucked into a treen that had been chewed into stumps. The snow never really left. It only changed texture. At night it crusted into glass. At dawn it softened and swallowed the footprints of men on patrol. She learned the terrain the way other people learn their kitchens. The slope that drifted first, the blind hollow that never filled, the ridge that made the wind run harder. Those details mattered to her in a different way. She worked through a ritual of tasks that everyone saw as monotonous. Rise before the flare of morning, strike the stove, split ice, carry water, cut roots, salt meat. But while she did it, she watched what others did with the casual eyes of someone who was always present. Guards changed at the same minutes every day, their boots crunching on packed snow. The radio in the signal tent clicked at certain hours, and when it went quiet, the men nearby drifted into the kitchen for coffee. Supply trucks arrived with the same predictable delays, their drivers stamping their feet and warming their hands above her stove. She tracked it all in her head, because she had to. She learned how long it took a patrol to circle back, where they cut through the trees when the snow deepened, which routes were avoided because of drifting. She learned the rhythm of a place that was supposed to be in chaos. It was not. It was a machine. Machines had patterns. When the days were clear, she would step outside and breathe in the sharp metallic air. She noted the angle of smoke from the chimney. She counted the seconds between distant booms and the thump that came after. Not because she feared it, but because she needed the map of sound. When she chopped wood, she listened to the difference between the staccato of friendly mortar and the low, distant report of enemy artillery. She never let her face show that she was listening. It was safer if no one saw her paying attention. No one asked why she had been there for so long. In a war that stretched and shifted, 10 years was a lifetime. She arrived young, without a family name anyone recognized. And she was still there after officers rotated, after a new insignia took the place of the old, after the map lines were redrawn by hand. The men saw her as constant. Constancy made her invisible, but it also fed a quiet question she never answered aloud. Why had she stayed when most people found a way out? She had an answer, but it lived behind her eyes and never reached her mouth. The longer she stayed, the easier it became to pretend she was only what they thought. The harder it became to remember what she had been before. She fought that with discipline. Each night after she had cleaned the pots and banked the coals, she stood alone in the cold and rehearsed the routes she had learned, the ranges she had calculated, the angles of the ridge lines. It was not nostalgia, it was maintenance. She developed small habits that kept her sharp. She kept a piece of charcoal and marked days on a scrap of crate wood, hidden under her cot. She traced the arc of the sun in winter, and the way it skimmed the horizon, a low pale light that made shadows stretch for yards. She learned how long it took for a kettle to boil in different winds, and what that meant for the density of the air. She noticed the way canvas snapped when it was about to tear, the way rope stiffened before it broke, the way snow shifted before it slid off a tent roof. Those details kept her grounded in a world that could otherwise become a haze of sameness. In the kitchen, heat and cold collided. Steam clouded her vision, then cleared when the door opened and a gust rolled in. The smell of fat and onions clung to her sleeves. She used those smells as markers for time, for memory. When the onions burned, she remembered a patrol that had arrived late. When the stew thickened, she remembered a night when the generators failed and the radio clicked its last message into the dark. These were not sentimental memories. They were linked to routes, and routes were linked to the mission. She kept her posture modest and her movements contained. A visible cook was a cook who could be asked questions, and questions could lead to attention. She avoided attention by being dependable. She took no extra rations, refused the offer of a better sleeping spot, and kept her voice low. She blended in so well that even when new men arrived, they accepted her as part of the structure. The way they accepted the stove and the smoke and the bitter coffee. The routine was steady enough to make a person numb, but she did not allow herself that luxury. She could not. In this place, the kitchen was a blind spot and a lifeline. A place no one expected danger. And that expectation was the shape of her assignment. The snow kept falling. The line kept holding, and she kept cutting the routes into perfect rounds. She kept count of everything that mattered. She had been inserted early, when the front was still fluid, and the people who made decisions believed they could wrap the war quickly. The cover was simple. A cook, a civilian contractor, someone who knew how to stretch rations and keep men on their feet. She had taken the job because it was a doorway into a place no one else could reach. No one asked about her background beyond a short file, and she had been trained to make that file plausible. The real orders were not in the file. They were a single page, a sealed packet, and a voice that met her in a room far from the snow. It told her to watch and wait. There was an enemy formation on the other side of the line that would one day expose its command chain, and she was to be the instrument. She was not to act until she could remove the head cleanly. Until then, she was to learn everything about the terrain, the pattern of movements, the routine of communications, and the habits of the men who thought they were safe. She accepted because she could, because her skill set was narrow and precise, and the mission matched it. She accepted because in her life before, she had learned how to be patient, how to sit in place without making a ripple, how to measure a day in the smallest increments. She accepted because the alternative was to carry a rifle in the open where a single mistake would end her. In this kitchen, she could survive for years and become the blade that no one saw. The years came slowly and then all at once. She watched a generation of soldiers pass through. Some young and careless, some old enough to know what they were losing. She served them with the same steady hands. She watched the enemy shift their lines, harden their positions, hide their leadership behind layers of routine. She sent sparse reports when conditions allowed, coded in supply notes or in the timing of radio check-ins. Each report was a small pin in a map, and she waited for the moment the map would align. The mission had no date because the enemy did not offer one. It was an open window that would only open wide if she had the patience to let it. That was the cost. The longer she waited, the more her cover became her life, and the more the losses around her accumulated without her response. She watched men she served with go out on patrol and never return. She watched the medics carry bodies past her stove. She watched the grief flicker and fade into fatigue. She did not allow herself to react beyond what her role allowed. She poured coffee. She ladled stew. She said only what was necessary to keep the line moving. Her emotions did not vanish. They compressed. She carried them the way she carried heavy water buckets. Careful and balanced, always aware of the weight. At night she lay in a narrow cot and listened to the wind scrape the canvas. She replayed each loss as a tally. It did not make her kinder or crueler. It made her more exact. She understood what was at stake if she failed, and she understood what would be demanded of her when the day finally arrived. She was trained to take a shot and move. But this mission had required a different endurance. The ability to live in a cover for years without mistake. There were days she believed the order would never come. Days when the front shifted, and it seemed the command chain would remain forever hidden, but then a hint would appear. A shift in patrol timing, an unguarded corridor. A new relay tent moved closer to the kitchen line, and she would return to the inner map she had built. She had no expiration date, because the mission could not be rushed. That was the agreement. She would wait as long as it took. The cost was the quiet that built inside her. The knowledge that the one day she had been trained for might never arrive, and that if it did, she would have to be ready without having fired a shot in 10 years. She kept herself capable by practicing without a rifle. She measured distances with a cook's eye, the length of a ladle handle, the width of a worked, the space between the stove and the door. She used those measures outdoors, translating them into ranges, angles, and lines of sight. She watched a coyote cross the frozen field and calculated where its body would be at each step. She kept her breathing steady when she lifted heavy pots, so that it would be steady when she pressed a trigger. The discipline was invisible to the others. It was constant in her. She also maintained a quiet network of observation. She noted which officer spoke softly and which barked orders. She tracked when the medical tent was busiest and when the supply line fell behind. She learned how long it took for a new order to ripple across the line. Those details told her how quickly the enemy could react if she ever struck. They also told her how quickly her own side could respond, which mattered just as much. A clean shot was not only a matter of accuracy. It was a matter of timing and consequence. There were nights when she imagined walking away. The kitchen was a rough life, and the cold had eaten years from her body. But the mission was not a job to be finished when it became hard. It was a promise. She had given it, and she had trained herself not to break it. The winter kept returning, and she kept returning to the stove. The mission had no expiration date, and neither in those years did she. The enemy lived close by, closer than most of the men admitted. The lines were a patchwork of woodlots and frozen creek beds, and the field kitchen sat at a point where a narrow corridor cut through. The enemy sent patrols that crossed near the cookhouse. Sometimes within a few hundred yards. They were not invisible. They were ordinary. She saw the smoke from their fires on clear mornings. She heard their voices when the wind shifted. She watched their patterns the way she watched her own side. And over time, those patterns became familiar. There were days when captured radios carried their chatter and days when their supply convoys moved in sight of her line. They had their own rhythm, their own rituals. The men who ventured near the kitchen line came to see her as a harmless figure. A woman bent over a cutting board. Some had even shouted requests across the snow during lulls. Crude humor tossed into the cold. She never responded. She kept her eyes down, her posture neutral. That silence made her part of the landscape. They stopped paying attention. She learned their habits the way a cook learns a new recipe. Slow, patient, precise. She marked the times their sentries passed a gap in the trees, the direction their boots scuffed, the way their patrols fanned out and then narrowed when they returned. She could tell when they were under orders and when they were simply bored. The difference was in their pace, in the length of time they lingered at certain points. She cataloged the routes that led back to their rear positions, and the paths that were never used. Over time, their proximity made the mission heavier. They were not abstractions. They were men who ate, cursed, grew thin, and smoked to warm their hands. She saw them at their most ordinary, and that human detail had a weight. It was easier to imagine an enemy at a distance. It was harder to hold a scope over a person you had watched for years, even if that person belonged to the force that was killing your people. She did not indulge in sentiment. She kept the reality clean. The mission was not about a grudge. It was about ending a command chain that fed the war. She repeated that to herself like a rule. But the familiarity still added pressure. The longer she watched, the more she understood the way their routine protected them. It also revealed the cracks. Their sense of safety around the kitchen was one of those cracks. And she knew it was a crack she had been placed to exploit. Her inner conflict was not about the act itself. It was about the time invested in being invisible. She had spent a decade listening, observing, mapping. On some mornings, she felt like she could not separate her role as cook from the role as sniper. The smell of boiling coffee was tied to the memory of wind speed. The act of cleaning a knife was tied to the idea of cleaning a shot. She had merged her cover with her craft. That gave her a kind of calm. But it also made the day of action feel like a betrayal of the only life she had known in years. She kept moving anyway. She continued to ladle stew when the enemy patrols passed close enough to hear. She continued to keep her eyes down. The more they saw her as a fixture, the more complete her invisibility became. That invisibility was the weapon. She carried it with a steadiness that no one noticed. She also studied the enemy's supply rhythm. When their bread wagons came, there were always 2 extra guards. When their fuel trucks arrived, the drivers smoked for exactly 3 minutes before climbing back into the cab. She noticed how their officers walked with gloved hands behind their backs, How they paused at the same rise to scan the line. How they avoided the low ground in heavy snow, because it swallowed their boots. Each habit was a line in her internal ledger. Each line added weight to the day she would have to act. She learned the faces of men who would never learn hers. A sergeant with a limp. A young runner who always lifted his collar against the wind. A sentry who liked to stand at a particular pine, because the branches shielded him from the snow. None of them were her target, but all of them were part of the pattern. She stored their movements the way she stored the positions of rocks and gullies. If any of them moved differently, it would mean the pattern had shifted. That would mean danger. It would also mean opportunity. The closeness of the enemy made the war feel smaller. The line was not a distant front. It was a frozen corridor that both sides could see. Her kitchen was a hinge between those sides. She kept it working, kept it warm, kept it quiet. She let the enemy see only a cook. She let her own side see only a cook. The familiarity on both sides strengthened her cover, but it also demanded that she remain a constant, a human fixture in the snow. That constancy was her longest test. The signs came in small increments. The first was the weather, a shift in the wind that settled into a rare stability. Snow deepened and then stilled. The air was cold but clear, and the gust that usually twisted across the ridge eased into a straight line. She felt it on her face when she stepped outside, the way the air held steady rather than swirled. In her mind, she measured it in degrees and in drift, in what it would do to a bullet at distance. It was the kind of condition she had waited for. The second sign was in the enemy's movement. Their patrols clustered in a way she had not seen before. Men gathered near the corridor behind the trees, and the usual relay tents moved closer to a shallow depression that provided cover. She watched as a long radio antenna was erected where there had only been a short one. That meant a higher level signal, a command link. It was not proof, but it was an alignment on her internal map. The third sign came from her own side. The signal tent near the kitchen ran late into the night, the radio clicking in short bursts, then going quiet. A runner came down the frozen path and spoke in a low voice to the officer on duty. Orders were not shouted. They never were when they mattered. The officer glanced toward the kitchen and then away as if making sure he was not watched. That glance did not mean he knew her. It meant he was under pressure. She did not act on signs alone. She waited until she received a direct activation. That message arrived in a form that would have been meaningless to anyone else. A supply crate came in with an inventory tag that should have been blue but was red. The handwriting was not the usual quartermaster's. It held 2 words where a number should have been. One day, she stood for a moment with the tag in her gloved hand. The stove roared, the pot steamed, the men in line shifted and stamped their boots. Nothing in the kitchen changed, and that was the point. The message was a trigger, not a permission. The permission had been granted 10 years before. The message told her the window had opened. The day she had prepared for would be that day. She moved through the rest of her shift without change. She served meals. She scrubbed pans. She handed out bread. She listened for any sounds that indicated a surge in activity on either side of the line. She noted the snow's density. She noted the wind's stability. She noted the thin cloud cover that kept the light flat and hid small movements at distance. Every element aligned with the numbers she had carried in her head for years. That night, the snow fell heavier. It closed the world to a small circle of sound and light. It was the kind of night that erased mistakes. She slept for a short stretch, not because she was tired, but because she needed to move with a steady hand at dawn. The weight of the mission sat in her chest, quiet and complete. She did not let herself think of the aftermath. There would be time for that when the last shot was done. Before she slept, she checked the seams of her pack and the condition of her gloves. She stretched her fingers, feeling the stiffness in the joints from years of cold. She pressed her palm to the stove's metal side, just long enough to steal a little heat, and then stepped back into the unlit corner of the tent. She kept the image of the ridgeline in her mind the way another person might keep a prayer. The snow outside muffled every sound, and the quiet took on a new shape. It was no longer only the quiet of routine. It was the quiet of a threshold. She could feel the line of that threshold the way she could feel the line of a knife's edge. She went over the map one more time. Not because she feared she would forget it, but because the ritual itself kept her steady. A mission for her was a sequence of steps. She did not take a step without placing it in order. She rose before the others, moving in the dark as if she were a shadow within a shadow. She did not light the stove. She did not take down the pots. She left the kitchen as it was, a frozen room with a faint smell of ash and yesterday's stew. She set down the ladle on the wooden board with a care that had nothing to do with sentiment, and everything to do with habit. She had spent a decade turning the same tools in her hands, and she put them away the way a professional closes a kit. Her preparation was compact. She carried no excess. The rifle was broken down and hidden within the frame of a supply pack, a shape that would not be questioned if someone glanced at it. Ammunition was counted to the exact number she intended to use. She packed a narrow strip of cloth, a small amount of food, a thermos of water. The rest was in her body, muscle memory, maps, and the patience that had kept her alive for 10 years. She did not look back when she stepped into the snow. The kitchen behind her was a shelter, but it had never been home. Her cover was a skin she had worn too long, and now she was shedding it without ceremony. She moved along the edge of the treen, keeping the drifted mounds between her and the open ground. Every step was measured. She knew exactly where the wind would carry her scent, and where it would die in the cold. She knew which branches were brittle and which were buried. She had walked this route in her mind thousands of times. The shift was not dramatic. It was a narrowing. She moved from the wide sphere of kitchen noise into the silent line of the trees. Her awareness shifted from voices and boots to the subtle crack of ice under snow. She listened for the rhythm of centuries and for the distant scrape of a shovel. She had no need to rush. Speed was not her advantage. Timing was at a shallow rise. She stopped and assembled the rifle. Her hands did not shake. The metal was cold against her gloves, and the sound of the bolt sliding into place was the only noise she allowed herself. She checked the scope, not for clarity, but for alignment with the world she knew. She lay prone and let the weight of the snow settle around her. The wind held steady. The line of the ridge stood clear. The map in her head matched the world in front of her. The day had begun. She pressed her cheek to the stock and tested her breathing. The cold air burned her lungs, but her exhale was slow and even. She counted to 4 on each breath, a cadence learned long before the kitchen. The smell of smoke clung to her coat, and she welcomed it. It would blend with the battlefield, another layer of ordinary. She spread a thin cloth over the snow to break the outline of her body. The work was exact, small, and quiet, like folding dough. She waited for the first light to lift the darkness. The snow reflected the pale sky, creating a glow that had no warmth. She did not hurry. She had waited 10 years. She could wait another hour. When the line finally sharpened, and the distant trees separated from the gray, she allowed herself to settle into the stillness. The first targets would appear soon, and the morning would decide the day. She kept her pack within arm's reach and her gloves loose enough to feel the trigger. Her face was covered, only her eyes exposed to the wind. She let the cold carve a thin edge around her focus. The winter did not feel hostile to her anymore. It felt like a material like the metal of a pan or the weight of a cleaver. She knew how it behaved, how it softened, how it resisted. She moved within it without struggle. Behind her, the kitchen remained dark. It was a room full of the smell of ash and grease and work. She did not imagine it mourning her absence. In this place, people vanished and were replaced, and the work continued. She had become part of that cycle. Leaving it behind was not a dramatic departure. It was a step into another routine, one that would last a single day. Her first targets were not the highest-ranking men. They were the rhythm keepers. The war on that line moved by routine. Runners, signal operators, spotters who fed information to officers in the rear. If she could cut those threads, the rest would stall. She had watched which figures crossed the clearing at predictable intervals, which ones carried the radio pack, which ones paused at the same stump each morning to light a cigarette. Those were the points that held the machine together. The first shot was quiet in the snow. It traveled and vanished, the sound smothered by the white. The man she chose folded where he stood. She did not watch long. She moved her scope to the next position, counting the seconds to the next routine movement. It arrived as expected. The second shot cut the line before any alarm reached the rear. It was not a burst. It was a measured sequence, a series of precise breaks in the enemy's morning. Confusion did not arrive immediately. The enemy expected accidents in winter. A man could slip into a ravine, disappear under a drift. At first, they searched without urgency, their movements slow and cautious. She used that hesitation. She cut a spotter who lifted binoculars on the far ridge. She took the radio operator, who stepped into a clearing to improve reception. Each shot was a thread pulled out of a weave. The fabric began to loosen. She did not fire many rounds. The mission was not about volume. It was about effect. With each target removed, the enemy's ability to coordinate shrank. She could see it in their changes. Runners appeared, but they hesitated at every open stretch. Men clustered near tree trunks, unwilling to cross in the open. The line of communication slowed, then broke into fragments. She stayed still, letting the snow cover her rifle and her shoulders, letting the world move around her while she held the center. She worked with the same economy she used in the kitchen. She did not waste motion. She did not indulge in urgency. Her breathing was low, her cheeks steady against the stock. The morning light was flat and forgiving. It erased the shine of her scope and made small movements hard to detect. She used it like a shield. By mid-morning, the enemy's forward line had lost its quiet structure. The rhythm was gone. She watched the gaps open in real time. A runner paused too long at a tree and then backed away, uncertain. A spotter raised his binoculars, then lowered them, unsure where to look. A radio pack lay in the snow, its antenna broken, and no one rushed to retrieve it. The enemy's routine was dissolving into caution. That was the opening she had been trained to create. She did not allow herself satisfaction. The morning was only one part of the plan. She shifted her weight slightly, careful not to disturb the powder beneath her. The cold seeped into her ribs, a slow ache. She let it in, used it to stay awake. She had learned that the cold, if accepted, became another tool. It kept her alert. It sharpened her focus. She glanced at the clock on her wrist, a quiet habit. Time mattered. She had a sequence to follow, and the sequence was moving forward. She took a final shot in that position, not because it was needed, but because it was clean. A man stepped into a gap she had marked years before. A gap that existed because a fallen tree had been cleared and never replanted. He paused, lifted his radio and stood still. The distance was true. The wind was steady. The shot was precise. She watched him fall, and then moved her scope away, already shifting to the next phase. Morning had been about cutting the rhythm. It had worked. Now the enemy was reacting, and reaction could create new openings or new dangers. She remained still, letting the minutes pass, reading the movements as a cook reads the surface of a simmering pot. The boil told her when to stir. The line told her when to move. By noon, they understood they were under deliberate attack, but they did not know from where the snow hit or sound. Their estimates of direction were wrong because the terrain twisted the wind. They fired into trees at random, rifles cracking in bursts that chased shadows rather than targets. She let them spend that energy. The more they fired, the more they revealed where their leadership gathered. She moved for the first time since dawn. It was not a sprint. It was a crawl through a shallow depression she had memorized years before. She used the wind to cover her. The snow had thickened, falling in slow sheets that blurred the line of sight. It was a strange protection, a veil that made the world smaller and therefore easier to control. She reached a second position she had marked in her mind. A rise that gave her a new angle on the relay tensed. She found the antenna first. It was higher now, taller than the small trees around it. Beside it moved a cluster of men with heavier coats and better gear. She waited for them to settle into the habits that made shots possible. When one stepped clear of the others, she fired. He went down. The cluster scattered, then tightened. She adjusted and fired again. The antenna tilted and then fell as someone rushed to lower it. That was a signal to her that she had struck the right place. The enemy's response grew sharper. A group moved along the tree line with a measured pace. Not a patrol, but a hunt. They moved in pairs, scanning, stopping, listening. One of them stepped close to the hollow where she had lain that morning. She held still and let him pass. The snow in her eyelashes melted and refro. The man paused, frowned, then moved on. The quiet after he left felt like a weighted blanket. Her position was still safe, but not for long. She took 2 more shots, each one a decisive interruption. Then she moved again, keeping low, sliding down a drift and into another fold in the terrain. This was the place she had been most careful to memorize. the narrow path that could only be used when the snow was deep enough to muffle steps. 10 years of watching had mapped it into her muscles. She moved through it without hesitation. The midday tension peaked when a sudden gust lifted the snow and opened the view. For a moment, she was exposed. A figure on the far ridge lifted his rifle. She fired first. The echo was swallowed by the return of the snowfall. She rolled sideways and pressed herself into the drift. Her heart rate stayed controlled, but her hands held the warmth of the shot. The line had nearly seen her. It did not matter. She had another position and a final list. The snow thickened again, and with it the sound dulled into a soft, constant hush. The enemy shots became sporadic, then frantic, then cautious. She watched them retreat into cover, and noticed how their formation tightened around a central point. That was where the remaining officers were gathering. She noted the angle, the distance, the wind. The afternoon still held work. But the midday cover had done its job. It had pulled them into a smaller circle and revealed the center. She took a moment to drink from her thermos, the water cold and metallic. Her throat ached from the dry air. She stretched her fingers, feeling the stiffness from holding the rifle. The snow collected on her sleeves and melted into dampness. She did not mind. The world was cold, and she was working with it, not against it. The midday phase was not a pause. It was a shift. She had disrupted the enemy's senses. Now she would have to disrupt their will. By early afternoon, the enemy's chain was fraying. Their forward positions were quiet, their rear positions crowded and tense. She could have stopped after removing the relay point and the local commanders. The line would have slowed. The day would have been considered a success. But her assignment was not to slow. It was to end. There was a last opportunity, a narrow window in which the highest target would expose himself. It was the kind of moment a mission waited 10 years to get, but it was also a moment with risk. To take the shot, she had to move closer to the open ground than she had intended. It would put her within range of a counter team if they saw her. It would mean less chance of extraction. It would mean no easy way back to the kitchen before night. She waited without drama. She had counted this possibility in her preparation. If the goal was to break the war on this line, she needed to remove the center. It was the only way to justify a decade of waiting. She adjusted her route. She used the noise of scattered gunfire to mask her movement. She crossed a short open patch when the wind picked up and the snow thickened. The world vanished and then returned. She was now in a position that offered a clear view of the shallow depression behind the enemy's relay tents. The target arrived with 3 escorts. He wore a different coat, one designed for command rather than for carrying ammunition. He moved with the stillness of a man who believed his position protected him. She watched him through the scope, allowing herself no emotion. She calculated the wind, the angle, the slight drift that the cold air would impose on the bullet. She waited for the instant when he stepped clear. She fired once. The man fell without a sound. For a breath, the world was silent. Then the escorts reacted, dragging him down, shouting into radios that no longer worked. The chain broke. She did not linger to confirm beyond the certainty of her own observation. She already knew the years of waiting had compressed into that single shot. And in that moment, the weight in her chest lifted in a hard, clean release. She moved immediately, not because of fear, but because the mission was complete and the rules of survival returned. The enemy would search with intensity now. She could not remain in the open. She withdrew along a route she had memorized in the early years, a path that stayed low and close to the frozen creek. The snow was deeper, the light beginning to shift. She moved like someone who had always belonged in winter. Her emotions did not break into tears or anger. They came out as a strange emptiness, a quiet that was larger than any winter silence. She had done what she was sent to do. The rest was endurance. She kept her breathing even. Her steps controlled. She kept moving. She passed a stand of thin pines where the branches hung low with ice. The needles brushed her shoulders and left a fine dust of frost on her coat. She paused to listen and heard the distant scramble of boots, the shouted commands that had lost their anchor. The enemy was now reacting without a clear hand. That was what the mission had been built to achieve. The cost of 10 years had been paid. The day in its last light belonged to her. She did not allow herself to linger on the shot. A sniper who lingers becomes a target. She focused on the route home, on the way the frozen creek bent around the ridge. on the place where the snow piled into a drift that could hide her pack for a moment. The afternoon light thinned, and the color of the snow shifted from white to pale blue. The cold deepened. She kept moving. The decision not to turn back had already been made, and now it carried her forward like a current. By dusk, the enemy line had collapsed into quiet. There was no cheering from her side, no sudden surge forward. The men in the trenches waited, listening for orders that did not come. The silence spread in ripples. The guns on the enemy side were still. The relay tents had been abandoned. The corridors she had watched for years stood empty. She returned to the edge of her own line as the light faded. No one challenged her, because no one expected a threat from the white. She moved past a sentry who glanced at her pack and kept his attention on the dark. She kept her head down, could feel the weight of the rifle inside the pack. But it was only weight now. The work was done. The meaning of the day did not require witnesses. She had not done it for a medal or a report. She had done it because the chain had to be broken. If the line held, it would not be because of a lone shot, but because the structure behind the enemy had been cut at the center. The effect would unfold in hours and days. She would not be there to watch it. She would not need to. She stepped into the shadow of the kitchen just as the first stars came out. The chimney was cold. The pots were still where she had left them. It looked like a place abandoned for an hour rather than for a lifetime. She set the pack down and stood for a moment in the doorway. The snow outside was untouched. The world was quiet in a different way now, the way it is after a storm clears. She did not allow herself celebration. The mission had cost too much time for that. It was not the kind of victory that wanted noise. It was a single day carved from 10 years. A day that had to be enough. She had measured it carefully, and she knew it was. She sat down, removed her gloves, and let the heat return to her fingers. The day was over. She listened to the small sounds of the kitchen settling, the wood contracting, the stove cooling. Each sound was familiar, almost comforting. But she did not confuse it for home. She had not been a cook by choice. She had been a cook by necessity. The work was done, and that meant her life could move again. That was the only luxury the mission allowed. The snow fell in slow spirals and the night held steady around her. She rinsed her hands in cold water and watched the steam rise from her skin. It reminded her of the morning, of the hook of the day, of the moment she stepped out of the kitchen. The circle had closed. She was back, but she was not the same. The line outside was changing, though no one yet knew how. She did not need them to know. The work of a hidden agent was to change the line without announcing it. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling. The canvas bowed with the weight of snow. She could hear the faint hiss of the wind and the occasional crack of wood outside. Her breathing slowed. She let the exhaustion roll through her without resistance. 10 years of waiting had used a different kind of energy. Now a single day had spent it. The quiet in her chest was not emptiness anymore. It was completion. Morning came again, the way it always did, thin and gray. The stove was still cold. She could have lit it and returned to the roll, but the roll had served its purpose. Still, no one would know that. That anonymity was the point. She wiped the counter, set the pots in order, and moved as if she had never left. The line would need food. The war would not stop on her schedule, even if the enemy line had fallen silent. Men drifted in, stamping snow from their boots, their faces drawn with lack of sleep. They asked for coffee. She poured it. They asked if she had heard the night silence. She nodded without speaking. Her answers were economical, the way they had always been. No one looked at her long enough to see the difference. That was the last gift of her cover. She carried the quiet with her. It was different now. Not a weight of waiting, but a weight of completion. She had been a cook to be invisible. She had been invisible to be in position. Now the mission was done, and she had to choose what came next. Her orders did not specify a future. They had never promised one. The snow outside kept falling slow and steady, and the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. She did not need recognition. It would have broken the purpose of the mission. She did not need to explain. In this war, explanation was a luxury. She allowed herself only one thought that morning, a line that crossed her mind as she stirred the pot. She had cooked for 10 years so that one day she would not have to cook. That day had arrived, and the stove was still here, and the snow was still falling. She set the ladle down the same way she had the morning before, and looked at the door where the wind pushed against the frame. Outside the line was quiet. Inside the work continued. She understood that this was the shape of the life she had chosen. No parade, no public record, only the certainty that the task was done. The blizzard would keep moving as blizzards always do. She would move too when the time was right. Slipping out as quietly as she had slipped in. She kept her head down and cut the roots, the knife on the board steady as breath, and waited for the moment she no longer needed to wait. As the day wore on, the kitchen filled with the normal noise of war. Boots, muffled coughs, the scrape of metal cups. The men spoke quietly about the sudden stillness on the far ridge. They did not know what it meant, only that something had shifted. She listened without reacting. She had learned to keep her face still when stories of loss traveled through the line. She kept that stillness now. In the afternoon, a runner came by with a short note, then moved on without stopping. She read it alone by the stove. It was not a congratulations or a request. It was a single line that confirmed what she already knew. She placed the note in the ash and watched it curl into smoke. The mission was finished. The stove was still warm. The snow kept falling. She did not make any immediate plans. The war had taken enough from her to make her careful with the future. If she left too soon, she would draw attention. If she stayed too long, she would risk being trapped in a role that no longer served a purpose. She let the day stretch in front of her and watched the small tasks return. Cutting, stirring, wiping, lifting. These tasks were familiar. They did not define her. They were a bridge. At dusk, she stepped outside and let the wind touch her face. The sky was a flat gray, the kind of sky that hid the depth of distance. She looked toward the line and felt the absence of sound. The guns were quiet. The world was quiet. That quiet was the consequence she had worked for. It was not peace. Not yet, but it was a break in the chain of violence. That was enough. She returned to the kitchen and banked the fire. The smell of smoke lingered on her coat. She hung the coat on a nail and sat down for a moment, hands folded, listening to the faint pops of the stove. She thought about the 10 winters she had spent in this place and the single day that had given those winters a purpose. The arithmetic was simple. The cost was not. She slept lightly as she always did. The cold pressed against the tent and the wind rattled the seams. She kept her eyes closed and let the stillness wash through her. She knew that soon she would be called away, or she would leave on her own, or the war would move and carry her with it. She did not know which path it would be. The uncertainty did not frighten her. It was just another element of the world, like the snow and the wind and the long steady quiet that followed a storm. She woke before dawn and felt the familiar ache in her hands. She rose and lit the stove because the men would need food and because habit was a cover in itself. The flames caught thin and blue, then brightened. She watched them for a moment and felt the warmth on her face. She was a cook and she was a sniper, and she was neither. She had been what the mission required. Now she would be what survival required. That was enough. She had cooked for 10 years so that one day she would not have to cook. The day had come and she had used it, and she had left the stove alive behind.